Hi, this is John, the owner and developer of VectorDecks. In this tutorial, I'm going to go over the VectorDecks technology involved when you're drawing multiple decks, particularly multiple decks at different levels within one single document. There are four very important aspects of this technology. The first being the sundeck name. When you create a sundeck surface using the VectorDecks frame tool, by default, it'll be assigned a name called sundeck. You can name that whatever you want. When creating a single deck on a single document, I encourage just leave the name sundeck, because all the other tools upon their creation will also be assigned the name sundeck. So all the tools with the same name as the frame will listen to all the different kind of changes involved when you make that change at the sundeck frame level. The next being use deck info, and that's the same sort of concept as I explained with the sundeck name. When you use any of the other tools, you'll see a button that says use deck info, and by default that's checked. And what happens there is when you assign a rail the same name as the frame and use deck info is turned on, it'll follow along with any changes you make in that frame. If you make the elevation change or anything else involved in that, it sort of listens to it. It's like a parent-child type of relationship. The next being the deck height. That'll be the top of the deck to grade. The last is delta Z. Now that's a strange name when designing sundecks, but it's a very important coordinate assignment within Vectorworks' three-dimensional world. In 2D, you have an X and Y coordinate, which would be X being right to left and Y being up and down. But to get into the three-dimensional world, you need that third dimension, and that's where the delta Z comes into play. I kept the name delta Z because you'll see that coordinate throughout Vectorworks' environment when you're involved in anything that's three-dimensional. But in the VectorDecks world, that'll be where the top surface finishes on the home. So if you have a home where the door sill is, let's say, up about 48 inches and you want this deck to finish right below the door sill, the delta Z within VectorDecks would be set to 48. And that way everything works from that door sill down. We'll show you this when we design these three different deck surfaces. So what I have here is I've created three squares using Vectorworks rectangle tool, and I'm going to keep this simple. I'm going to make these deck surfaces small, so they're only 5 foot by 5 foot. Now I'm going to go ahead and convert these rectangles to VectorDecks frames. I'm going to select that first one, and then go over here and click on VectorDecks Convert. Click on that surface again and make sure, by default VectorDecks frame is selected, but make sure it's selected. Click OK. Now I have that first frame, and you'll notice over here, it by default gives it a name of sundeck, the height. These are all default settings, the height at 60 and the delta Z at 0. I'm going to keep that the same on all three. I want to show you the whole process and the different elevations, and we'll change that later. I'm going to select that second one and do the same thing. And because VectorDecks searches and sees that there's a deck already called sundeck, it's going to add this little -1 to it because it doesn't want to have the same name on the document, the same frame name. Let's go to that third one, go through the same process, and you'll see it added a -2. So we have three decks now on here. We have sundeck, sundeck 1 and sundeck 2, and the height and the delta Z's are all the same. Now next I'm going to go ahead and add the beams to each one of these so we have a good example here, even though this is such a small deck. So on that first one I'm going to go ahead and add a beam here. Again, by default it's going to say sundeck, so we're okay with that. On that second one, it's also going to say sundeck. And because we didn't change the name, it's going to stick to any information that this first one has. I'm going to leave that alone for now just to show you that example. And then I'm going to do one more beam in here for that third one. Again, by default, it says sundeck. So now this document thinks, or these beams all think they are part of this sun deck. Now I'm going to go ahead and add a rail. I'm going to click on the rail tool. I'm going to add a rail to each one of these deck surfaces the same. So just simple click, double click at the end, and you'll see here it'll give it the name sun deck by default. And do the same on this deck and this last deck. Now again, by default, they all have that sun deck name. So they all think again that these rails belong to the sun deck over here, the very first one that we drew. Also, even though each frame has a different name assigned to it, all the different parts on this document, all the beams and the rails, were all set to the same deck height, even these frames, the same deck height and the same Z level. Now I'm going to go ahead and select all three of these frames and convert it to 3D. By the way, if you're having trouble selecting the frames, I have this option here within the VectorDecks menu to custom select, and you want to click on frames, and then it's going to select any VectorDecks frame in your document. So if you have a whole bunch of them, it's going to make it a little easier to go that route. And now with all of them selected, I'm going to click on Draw 3D. Now I'm going to go to a three-dimensional view. Let's go to front. And here you see that all three decks are all at the same level. They're all at the same height. Everything looks like I designed three different decks all at the same level. Also, you'll see a blue line appear through that document. That's that Z level, and the current Z level for all the frames are set to 0. So that is set to 0, and that's the top of the deck surface. In part 2 of this tutorial, I'm going to show you how in changing the delta Z's and the elevations for each one of these sun decks will change the elevation of the decks in the drawing.